All right, hello, and welcome back to another Dragon Plus live stream. I am your host, Bart Carroll, and with me, I'm just going to say, as always now, is Jeremy Crawford, a lead designer of the Player's Handbook and a lead rules designer of Dungeons and Dragons.
Hello, everyone. It's sort of almost always.
Almost, yes, that's true. Our live stream is almost always. There's things that happen. There's weather delays, there's vacations, these things happen. Yeah. There's work. Believe it or not, outside of the live streaming endeavors.
It's true. We don't sleep here in this studio, just waiting for our next chance to manifest on Twitch.
Have you ever slept here at the office?
No, I haven't. I've worked into the wee hours of the morning before, but I've never slept here.
Yes, I've slept here before. Back when our previous, not even our live stream studio, our podcast studio, had a couch and a door that could lock. Mm-hmm. If I was here really late, I would take a nap, a long nap on the couch. So, yeah.
Nap times at work would be nice.
So it is, I'm going to start, first by explaining what we're going to be talking about today. We did cover a bit of the most recent Unearthed Arcana, the first of 2020 subclasses part 1 last week. We lightly touched upon all 4 of the subclasses that were introduced for the Barbarian, Monk, Paladin, and everyone's favorite, the Warlock. My favorite, the Warlock.
Thank you for clarifying what everyone means in this case.
I'm going to make sweeping general statements here.
Can we take a 30-second break? I need to swap out Jeremy's mic.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
We got a technical audio issue. We will be right back with a new mic on Jeremy.
I guess I destroyed it.
Are we taking it down, or are we just doing it live while you replace this mic?
We will take it down. It's
all right.
Really bad if we don't.
We'll see you all soon.
We'll be back in 30 seconds. And we're back. How do we sound?
I don't know. I'm afraid to talk now.
Yes.
For fear that I am launching some sort of thunder attack on our viewers. So my apologies to everyone if you have been taking thunder damage over the last 10 minutes.
Thunder damage. I was mentioning that we were going to be talking today a little bit more about the Unearthed Arcana that we touched upon last week, subclasses part 1. We did have questions come in from everyone listening, watching, and thank you. So we'll be going through those principally. I did want to start off by asking, as always, if you're reading, writing, listening to anything these days, as it might pivot into Dungeons and Dragons especially.
Well, I am finally playing a video game which, like many video games, is inspired by Dungeons and Dragons, and that is
All of them.
yeah. It is true. Almost every video game has something in it inspired by D&D, even if it's simply the mechanic of leveling up.
Or Pac-Man, the healing potions. I
Yeah.
suppose you could make a rough argument.
Yeah.
there.
But I've been playing Fire Emblem Three Houses on the Switch. It is a very well-made tactical RPG with a fascinating mix of young people at school and horrific war story and all jammed together.
Ooh, all right.
Yeah, I mean it at times is jarring because you're playing through some sequences where it feels like, we're at Hogwarts, and then the next sequence is murder. But it works, and I often enjoy that kind of turn-based RPG. This might shock some people, but I finally tried The Witcher 3. It's a very well-made game, yet I set it aside to play Fire Emblem.
A very diplomatic answer.
Yes, yeah.
I am slowly working my way through the Witcher series on Netflix as well.
Okay.
I am waiting for it to pick up a bit.
All right.
But
I've seen only the first episode, and I will probably watch the rest of it. But right now I am catching up on Sabrina on Netflix.
I heard that went a little Riverdale, or it's going a little Riverdale.
Well, it is going all sorts of things.
Okay.
Yeah, it is over the top. It's filled with witches and other critters, all sorts of extraplanar threats, and in a way related to Fire Emblem Three Houses. It's like we're in school, early relationships, murder. That's all mixed together.
Is your enthusiasm for hags, does that also carry over into witches, or are those two separate entities?
Absolutely. So,
Okay.
To be clear, my love of hags started when I was a kid as a love of witches.
Okay.
So to me, witches is the broader category
Yes.
that can include characters of all sorts. Benevolent, malevolent, male, female, non-gendered. To me, the witch category is much broader than the hag category. But so hag is a subset that I love because, as I've said many times, just all the storytelling possibilities with hags.
Yes.
Their sass, their crankiness, their intelligence, but also their appetites. They're a great villain in that way, where you often like to have a villain that, cunning, dangerous, but usually some appetite that can be used against them to their peril.
Would you consider Emperor Palpatine a witch?
So the Jedi in some forms, and then specifically a character like Palpatine, definitely have elements in them of sort of the classic witch or wizard or sorcerer. And especially Palpatine with his, shooting lightning and messing people with people's minds.
Right.
And many people forget that in the original Star Wars film, Vader at one point was even referred to by an Imperial officer as a sorcerer.
Oh, yeah.
It was actually always disappointing to me that after the original trilogy, that Jedi and Sith seem to be reduced down to people who can flip and use lightsabers. Because for me, it was always way more cool, the implication in the original films that, no, these are just people with amazing mystical abilities. Some of them wield laser swords.
Right.
But in the original trilogy, there were, five main Force users, and two of them did not use lightsabers. And so even that
movies.
I know, even the prequels. I'm like, why is one person who can telekinetically throw spaceships and another person who can shoot lightning out of their fingers, why are they having a sword fight? Merchandising.
Yes, there you go. And so is our gratuitous Star Wars sidetrack of the week.
Eventually, we promise we will eventually reach escape velocity from Star Wars, but it's hard because we just had a new movie, we had The Mandalorian, and a warning, in March I'm going to Disneyland to go to the new Star Wars land, so the Star Wars infection will continue.
Well, here's how I would couch this discussion in a way, is within the halls of Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro, we tend to talk very carefully about our brands and not about other brands, because we shouldn't really have an official line on yay or nay. However, if you're a dungeon master, player of Dungeons and Dragons, you are not beholden to those restrictions. And so as a dungeon master, you're going to take influences from whatever inspires you across the media. And for players, the same with your character concepts, whatever inspires your character concept. So every once in a while, I do like to sort of push the conversation outside of our IPs, because that's, I think, what is going on around the gaming table, outside of the halls here.
Absolutely, because almost always these talks that we have end up right back at D&D.
Which is the intent, which is the hope.
Because of the inspiration we so often take as dungeon masters and players from the other stories that we're enjoying.
Right.
Heck, I even, last year did an Acquisitions Incorporated episode that was almost entirely a homage to the Jabba barge scene in Return of the Jedi. So anything you're watching, whether it's The Witcher, Sabrina, Star Wars, or anything else, always look, if you're a DM, for some juicy things you can take as inspiration and have those things bloom into an adventure or an NPC or even an entire campaign.
Or as a dungeon master, if you're looking to help bring new players into the fold, here's an example of something we can't do, but I encourage other people to do. If somebody is completely unfamiliar with Dungeons & Dragons and doesn't quite know what character concept they're interested in playing, but take a look at Marvel's Avengers. Well, which character speaks to you as an archetype? Okay, well, there's a bit of a ranger, the Hulk is a bit of a barbarian,
right? And
let's take it from there and build your character out.
Because you can build a bridge from the familiar to the unfamiliar.
Yes.
Basically, this is a tip for bringing people into your role-playing hobby, is help them. And I've even had to have this conversation, because sometimes I'll meet somebody at a gathering and they'll, what do you do for work? And I'll say I work on Dungeons and Dragons, and they often have no idea, what that means. And although more and more people know what D&D is,
yes,
but I will often use things in other stories, in other worlds, and in other brands, to build a bridge to D&D to help them understand what the characters are like, the types of adventures they go on, and whatnot.
I'm thinking back now, and admittedly, as a newbie dungeon master back in the day, how I first learned to create my own adventures were to blatantly recreate scenes that I did know from media. It wasn't so much of an homage. It was, I don't know my own creative interests yet, but I do know I like Predator. And so there's this strange monster that the characters are going to be hunting while it hunts them. And then from there, start learning, you get a few more beats down, and you're able to branch out and continue to take what inspires you.
Well, I think that's great advice even for an experienced DM, because many of you who might be veteran dungeon masters have probably had that week, or maybe even a series of weeks, where you have a session coming up and you're not sure what to do. Your creative well is, the water's a little low. There's nothing wrong with taking a plot from a novel, a movie, a comic book, a video game, and reskinning it, tweaking it, having fun with it, to really give yourself a rest. But also, there is a lot you can learn by taking a story and exploring it through your own storytelling. And if you're ever tempted to feel down about yourself for doing it, always remember, and I used to tell my students this years ago when I taught English, William Shakespeare endlessly ripped off plots from other plays.
Sure.
I mean, there is almost not an original plot in hardly anything he wrote. that often it was in the storytelling that his genius shone through, in the language and the characterization. Plots,
who says they need to be completely and from one of the strengths of Dungeons and Dragons, I would say, is a lot of the media that does inspire us. It's not interactive. We are ingesting movies and books and shows, but if we do set these scenarios down to interact with, here's our chance to play through the train heist in Solo or whatever else we would like to, and take it in fun and different ways and be part of it. Anyway, that was a longer tangent than I
but we managed to weave it all back into D&D. All roads lead back to Dungeons and Dragons.
Let me be true and honest to answering the questions that you have put in, so I'm going to jump right to it. Let me go to let's start with a fun one. This was one of the general questions. Unimportant Hero asked, I think this was at the start of chat from last week, asking Dungeons.
Unimportant Hero, you are important to me.
Yes. This was the pre-show chat going on Dungeons or Dragons, and we asked Dungeons or Dragons, and you went with both, so the ampersand. But they ask, is the classic dragon in a dungeon the fantasy equivalent of a ship in a bottle? How does it get in there? How does it get out? Where does it stretch its wings?
So I love this question because many early D&D adventures, back in the 70s and the 80s, did indeed have dragons and other large creatures that were in rooms that were they might fit in the room, but nowhere else in the dungeon.
They had spontaneously generated within this pre-existing space because there's no other way. They're shouldering through a standard door frame to get in there. Now,
there can be many explanations for this, whether it's in a modern adventure or in a new one. In an old one, the creature might have grown up in that space. They might have been shape changed. Especially with our metallic dragons, they can change shape.
Yes.
So they could walk in, live in a cottage scaled for, humans if they wanted to. So they also could have been portaled in.
I was just thinking.
Yeah, portals to and from other dimensions.
A spellcaster cast a summon monster spell of some sort, and it just never went away.
Yeah.
And it's persisted somehow.
Or DMs might hate me for saying this, but there could also be secret doors there that, if there's a creature that's in a chamber and you're wondering how the heck did they get in here, maybe there's a big garage door hiding, and that's how they get in and out of that space.
A murder in the Rue Morgue.
Yeah.
How did that? This is a locked room mystery. How did this person? I'm spoiling a 100-year-old story.
I think at that point you've passed the point where it's where it's okay to spoil it.
I am excited. There's a new Agatha Christie series coming, so yes, there's many. I like that. There's many ways to get an improbable creature into an improbable space for it, but maybe that lends itself to some mystery to solve.
Well, and DMs, especially if you're repurposing a classic dungeon map, and you want to put one of these huge creatures in there, but it seems improbable, that alone could inspire some adventure design of what is going on that's causing these large creatures to be in this smaller space. Now, you also, DMs, have an out, and that is the game does have squeezing rules. So it is possible that these really big creatures just squeeze through those hallways very slowly.
Yes.
And they made it to this larger room, and then they found the whole thing so tiring they decided not to squeeze their way out. And then if adventurers keep thoughtfully showing up and providing themselves as food, then I guess the monster doesn't need to leave.
No, that's my favorite line from any commercial was, any closet's a walk-in if you try hard enough. It's a real estate agent. Let's jump into subclasses for a bit. I'll start from the top here. 2CG Official asks, will the rules references that were very prevalent in the latest Unearthed Arcana be included in final design? I loved these inclusion and think it's a great way to help people understand some of the more finicky or obscure mechanics the subclass can use.
So we have been experimenting with the rule tips, not only in Unearthed Arcana, but also in some of our recent books. The Guildmaster's Guide to Ravnica has some, the Eberron book has some. This is a feature that we are likely to continue using in our books, partly because of the conversations that we have with many of you on Twitter, at conventions, and also the experiences we have playing and DMing D&D. It often becomes clear to us that, oh, this rule that we maybe thought everyone was aware of, they're not. The questions keep coming up about this. How about we make everyone's play experience a bit easier by putting right there, hey, this is how temporary hit points work. This is how armor class works. This is how jumping works. That was one of the most recent ones. I realized a lot of people sometimes forget that jumping in D&D does actually use up your movement. And so I put that jumping cost movement rule tip in this Unearthed Arcana. So there's a good chance that if, say, the Path of the Beast makes it into a book, that rule tip that's currently in the Unearthed Arcana would make it into the book too.
So what, perhaps a bit redundant as far as the verbiage, it's reducing friction as far as a rules lookup along the way.
Exactly. Now, the rules tips that we've done thus far always end up pointing you to usually the player's handbook for more information, because these are not meant to replace the rule in the rule book. We still want you to go look at it. So it's really there as just a big reminder, hey, there's a rule for you to be aware of if you're going to use this class feature. We've also put the tips in sidebars as opposed to in the running text itself, because we don't want there to be any confusion that the tip is somehow a functional part of the subclass.
Okay.
It's a removable part.
This isn't a unique feature.
No.
This is a rules reminder.
Exactly. Yeah. Jumping cost movement is a rule of the game, not a rule of the Path of the Beast.
Gotcha. Let's go to the monk, because the monk is also very cool. I'll go with Jappleton here first regarding the Way of Mercy. I did print it out here.
Yep.
Regarding the Way of Mercy, is there any concern with giving player options that rely on poison? I ask because so many enemies are immune to the condition, damage type, or both, and having a feature negated feels rough. In parentheses, the poor spores druids.
So, first off, with the Way of Mercy, we have no concern about them having poison, because they also have necrotic damage and they also have their lovely fists. Because as a monk, they can use, of course, their unarmed strike. They could also use any of their monk weapons. So they have many damage type options built into the subclass. I would also caution people to sort of get too caught up in what I think of as internet concerns about the game that might not play out in actual play. And I see often the poison one being in this category.
How so?
So it is true, it's an undeniable fact that many monsters in D&D, particularly high CR monsters and undead, have resistance or immunity to poison. However, in many campaigns, that fact is irrelevant because you might spend little or no time ever facing those monsters. So this goes into the category of things that we have an eye on, but which are not a concrete issue for every single game of D&D. Because you could have a game of D&D where you're mostly fighting sort of classic D&D baddies, orcs, dragons, and other, large, sort of physical monsters that aren't undead or ghostly or from another plane.
All in a 10 by 10 room.
Right, where a concern like this will never manifest, where the person who's dealing poison damage is rarely going to feel, the sting of their damage being resisted. Now, also keep in mind, resistances exist for a reason, and that is for you to occasionally feel the sting of your damage being resisted. And we design the game so that you eventually have to switch. Now, there are a few cases where we have leaned a little too heavily in the game on a particular damage type like poison, and maybe didn't give the character enough options. But even, say, a druid who, like the spore druid that has a lot of poison abilities, also still has access to the entire array of druid spellcasting. And druids are full spellcasters with many damage types that they have access to. So again, even there where you have somebody that is heavily relying on a single damage type, if they end up in the situation where, like, oh boy, we're going up against a bunch of fiends, for instance, that might resist this damage type, well, use the other spells and weapons in your arsenal. And I get it, it can be rough if the DM happens to pick creatures that line up, but that's also a part of the unknown that is in D&D, because it's the DM who decides ultimately what's going to end up at the table. You could also have a situation, and this actually I've seen come up in play far more often than the poison issue, is actually games where the DM, knowingly or not, keeps using monsters that have resistance to non-magical bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage, yet forgot to give the characters magic weapons, and there's no spellcaster in the group, or the spellcaster in the group refuses to cast a magic weapon. So that, to me, I've seen come up quite a bit. And so part of that is just the DM maybe needs to switch things up a bit in their monster selection. But also sometimes when I've seen it, it's also a group issue where the players are not examining deeply enough the rich resources their characters have, because many of our classes have tons of tools available to them, and we design those tools for a reason. They're to be used, and because part of the fun of D&D adventuring is you are going to come up against things that thwart you in some way, that blunt your most powerful attack in some way, essentially, in simpler terms, they throw you a curveball. Now, it is a concern for us if you are in a situation where the curveball's being thrown at you all the time.
That's where I was going. There is that dance between the player and the dungeon master where there's an understanding. Maybe your character has a specialization or a particular strength. It's not incumbent on the dungeon master to intentionally block that every time. That's just frustrating. But the occasional curveball and thwarting, but that is conflict, and that you do want. So there's a little bit of, it sounds like what you're saying is explore a little bit of the flexibility on both sides.
Exactly. Yeah, to me it is, the DM should, as in all things, pay attention to the player's mood, and if the players are really digging the challenge, they're really digging the curveball, well, keep going. But if you do, as a DM, sense some frustration, I think it's good to change course, switch up maybe your monster selections, and maybe don't have every single session involving someone's damage being resisted. And then if you're in a situation where, for maybe thematic reasons, it makes sense to use monsters that resist a particular character's favorite damage type, you can encourage the player to consider their character's many other options, or if maybe their options are actually limited, or the player just loves that damage type so much they don't want to switch, the DM could also explore things like giving them a magic item that gives them that gives the character a workaround, something that is going to, make the frustrated player a happy player. I mean, because at the end of the day, that is what we're always as dungeon masters striving for. Is we want to challenge our players, want to push them to the edge, but we don't want them falling over it and being frustrated because something feels too hard.
Right.
And the last thing you want is even worse than frustration. You don't want your players to feel like they're being targeted in some way or they're being purposefully inhibited. So also keep in mind, players, your DM might not realize that they keep selecting monsters that make your character feel less effective than normal. If that just keeps happening over and over again, just, after the session, just bring it up because it's possible, given all the things that DMs juggle, that the DM might not have noticed.
Right.
And the DM also, just like players have many tools at their disposal, not only in their character class, but also in their friends' character classes, the DM has tons of tools as well, both in terms of the monsters they can use, the traps they can use, the magic items they can give out, and so on.
I've often found one of the more enjoyable parts on both sides of the table is preparing for the encounter that's coming up and doing the investigation, and maybe that's just because we like investigations in our campaign, doing the investigation of what might we be facing, how do we best prepare for that, and getting that done in advance. And as the dungeon master, it's a bit of a reward for the players to find that out. You can feel prepared and smart. And for the dungeon master, that doesn't necessarily neuter the encounter either. You can still throw curveballs. Maybe the encounter, the sub-villains are more defensive against the particular damage type that's being thrown. Or the villain, King Snurd, he was a fire giant, but he wore a white dragon cloak to protect him. So there's other ways to play around with
that
that
poor
as well.
white dragon. I was just imagining, because it was a giant, it's probably just basically a big white dragon, skin that
Yes,
he's
it was like
wearing.
it was like a little hoodie PJ suit. It was adorable.
Like those adorable unicorn onesies.
Yes.
Yeah.
Let me ask, we'll move down to the warlock here. Hadnerfallen asks about the noble genie patron and the pact of the talisman and its invocations. Seem to have, the noble genie patron and the pact of the talisman seem to have some similarity overlap to their concepts. What considerations go into designing a new warlock subclass versus a new pact?
So a subclass for the warlock, which is of course a patron, is all about fleshing out what that patron would give the warlock. And so we look at what's thematically appropriate for the patron, what type of being are they in the D&D multiverse, and how best would we want a warlock to express that patron's gifts. Creating a new pact boon, as we did with the talisman in one of our recent Unearthed Arcanas, that's a different project because that's about creating an object that, or in the case of Pact of the Chain, you have a critter, creating a thing that would be usable for patrons of many different sorts. And so you naturally will end up with some overlap. For instance, not only does the noble genie have a little bit of thematic overlap functionally with the talisman, of course the hexblade subclass has a little bit of functional overlap with Pact of the Blade. But not everyone who has Pact of the Blade is a hexblade, and not every hexblade has the Pact of the Blade, just as not every warlock who might have the noble genie as their patron will have the talisman, and not everyone who has the talisman will have the noble genie. So it's actually purposeful for there sometimes to be some functional overlap, mostly so that we don't, for the warlock, lock certain functions to only certain patrons that warlocks of other patrons might also want. And so that's sort of why the class is unusual, in that it it has like a subclass choice and then almost like a subclass choice.
Yes.
And then you have Eldritch Invocations. The Warlock has a lot going on.
I want to study this field. I hate that professor. So what do I do here? Like, well, you can study it
Right.
under,
Right.
different instructors, or maybe do branch out a little bit.
Yeah. But I think to get back to the question, at the end of the day, patron choice is not only a choice that, of course, is going to give you class features, but it's a meaty story choice, whereas pact boon choice is much more of a functional choice.
Can deities be patrons?
So there is no rule that says they can't be. There is some story text in the player's handbook that states that a typical warlock patron is not a god, but that doesn't actually mean a warlock patron can't be a god. If we were writing that text today, I think we'd soften it a bit to basically be, the typical warlock patron is some sort of entity that is often not a god, but you could still make a pact with one. I think really what we were going for when writing the player's handbook is we were trying to draw out the distinction between the relationship the warlock has with their patron versus the relationship a cleric has with their god.
That's what, I can see that.
And over time it has become clear, I think, to the D&D community and to us, it is the nature of the relationship that is actually more important than, in some ways, the participants in that relationship. Because you can have a warlock who might have a pact with a god who is served by a cleric, and the cleric's relationship to that god is going to be very different from the warlock's relationship to that god. That bit of text in the PH about warlock patrons aren't gods, also even in the player's handbook, is not entirely accurate, precisely because it's true if you're in certain worlds. And what I mean by this is there are beings that are not gods in some worlds of the D&D multiverse, but they are worshipped as gods in other worlds in the D&D multiverse. So it could be, the being you serve is not a god in your world, but they might be a god in someone else's world because they gathered up enough worshipers to graduate in that world to godhood.
I think just the whole relationship between warlock and patron is just ripe for storytelling potential. I love it dearly.
And also, to be super clear to everybody, the Dungeon Master's Guide makes quite clear that the whole notion of godhood as sort of a classification in D&D is fuzzy. And so even sort of like, is it a god or not? To the game at the end of the day doesn't actually mean a whole lot. It's a storytelling thing. It's much more when as world builders for D&D, as storytellers for D&D, when we ponder this question, is something a god? The main outgrowth of the whatever answer arises from that question is really getting at, are there temples for this being? Are there worshipers for this being? Are there rituals associated with this being? And also possibly were they in some way involved in the great cosmic story? But even there it starts, then we go into the fuzzy area, because there are a lot of non-gods in D&D that played crucial roles in their corners of the multiverse, sometimes giving rise to cultures, peoples, monsters, worlds, and that's why I say it's a very fuzzy category. and I almost like to think of it just in sociological terms.
I was going to say, to tread carefully and lightly, but yes, there's parallels in the real world as well,
Right.
with what's ancient mythology that becomes a hero, becomes a demigod, becomes how does that work? And
Right.
there's
Yeah,
a
are
lot
there-
to study.
Yeah, and again, at the end of the day, it really just becomes a question of, are there temples, are there rituals, is there theology surrounding a being or a pantheon of beings and their stories?
What answer could you give Gozer, honestly?
Wow, we're
That's-
suddenly in Ghostbusters.
That's what it all comes down to. Calbar05 asks, what was the thinking in that the mountain dwarf, I believe empty dwarf, were the only sub-race in the player's handbook to get a +2 bonus to ability score?
The thinking was that it would be really special because, as the questioner points out, they're the only ones. I mean, that's we decided we wanted to make a strong, pardon me, a strong point about them, and that's the point we made.
Okay.
They're super duper strong.
Uh,
Because at the end of the day, there's no rule on what we can or cannot put into a subrace or a subclass, and we just decided we want
That's
this
how it
one to
is.
have a bonus to this ability score.
Because our mountain dwarfs go to +2. Kushi Sensei, going back to the monk with the Way of Mercy monk. Was it inspired by this form of yin and yang and more Eastern, or more monk like in the movies?
So
The inspiration for the Way of the Mercy monk.
yeah, so I don't remember if I mentioned it in an interview with Todd Kendrick or in our show. The inspiration for the Way of Mercy actually was Western European monasticism. We were thinking of someone in like a friar's robe during the Black Plague, and they're using their mystical energy to either cure people and heal their wounds if they've been in battles, or to bring the mercy of a swift death. And that's why with one hand they're dishing out life, and with the other one they are offering up demise. And we really wanted that dark dance with death sort of feel that you see in a lot of art and whatnot from the Western Middle Ages. And in fact, I see you Googling Name of the Rose. That
Yes.
reminds me, we did talk about that on this show.
We did, and I looked it up. I am infatuated with that movie, but I looked up the poster. Do you know the tagline for Name of the Rose?
I don't, and now I'm afraid to find out.
Who in the name of God is getting away with murder?
I know the answer
It's
because I've not only seen the film, but I've read the book it's based on.
yes, but it's a little bit of the little double entendre there. Of who in the name of God?
No, yeah.
So yes. we've got it up on the screen right now. Hopefully that's an actual movie poster and one that wasn't just created.
Right, that might just be fan art.
Could be.
Yeah,
Yes,
Sean Connery is ready for business in that painting.
he is. It's
Yeah, because in Western Europe, of course, that's what a monk looks like.
I was going to say, yes, so Name of the Rose, a great movie to watch for inspiration as far as the medieval monastic aesthetic look and feel, at least cinematically.
Which also is a heavy influence in D&D on many wizardly things. Medieval monasticism in Western Europe casts a long aesthetic shadow in fantasy because many wizards actually get some of their tropes, including actually the wizard school. Even like in Harry Potter, the location, those spaces that the students are in are heavily influenced by medieval monasteries.
The cells of study and...
Yep. Well, heck, even many of the cloisters shown in the Harry Potter movies for Hogwarts were actually shot in Durham Cathedral in England. So they were even using what was essentially a monastic cloister in the film to depict this wizard school. So yeah, it's funny that in D&D when we say monk, we actually mean like a monk who practices kung fu.
Right.
But even though in a Western European milieu, that word refers to something very different. Now, many people watching will say, well, doesn't it refer to a cleric? Because monks were, in Western Europe, they were part of a religious order. So not necessarily would they be clerics in D&D, because the clerics in D&D, first off, have miraculous powers, and not all monks were miracle workers. But also clerics, because of their ability to use weapons and armor, sort of are a mix of like priest and crusader,
Right.
Which is very different from like, a mendicant friar or, a bookish monk who's working in a scriptorium. I would say again, there's actually more of the bookish monk in the wizard in D&D than there is in the cleric. But Way of the Mercy was our stab at bringing a little bit of that European monastic flavor from the Middle Ages into the monk class.
And I was looking it up, and then you throw in a little bit of the hammer horror ability to fight undead as well. It gets baked into the DNA of the class.
Of the cleric.
Of the cleric,
Yeah.
yes.
Yep. Yeah.
It's a strange alchemy Dungeons and Dragons has done with, competing or divergent concepts of the real world monk, and then they bring in the cleric as a medieval crusader. They take a bit from here and here, and they've created their own. The game has created its own sort of version and concepts of these things that can still reference real world analogies in wonderful and varied ways.
Yeah.
Let's go Gatnatoa. I'm murdering everyone's name here. I love the backgrounds of 5th edition and often ask my players to build their characters based on it. Any thoughts on expanding or modifying those with some Unearthed Arcana or even a book?
So we do occasionally like putting out new backgrounds in some of our books. What I encourage any of you who haven't done a deep dive into backgrounds in the Player's Handbook, take a look at the introduction to backgrounds where we tell you how to make your own background. It was very purposeful on our part to make it so that you could use the information in the Player's Handbook to create any background you want. So we certainly will do more backgrounds in the future, because occasionally they're a great way for us to connect a character to a particular story or a particular world. Like our recent Eberron Rising from the Last War book has a background in it that speaks to being a person who came up in one of the dragon-marked houses. But if you use the guidelines in the Player's Handbook, you can create any background you want. And often I'll see people, I don't have the right background in any of the books. I need this one that will give me this skill proficiency and that skill proficiency. And again, take a look at that introduction to backgrounds, because using those rules, you can have any background you want.
And again, I imagine it's yet another corner of the game that is purposefully creative inducing for players, for dungeon masters. Is there a background that you're not finding? Here's your chance. Have at it. Work with your dungeon master, or as a dungeon master, present it to your players. Does it better fit your specific campaign? In Acquisitions Incorporated and in Eberron, there are new backgrounds as far as how that campaign setting and world works, so that your party members have a bit of a cohesion that makes sense. So it is again ripe for opportunity for creativity. So
yeah. Now that said, I can say that we have been noodling with something that might show up in Unearthed Arcana that plays around with background.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we'll look.
I have no idea when we're going to unleash it on the world, since Unearthed Arcana, basically stuff it comes out when it's ready to come out.
We're getting close to the top of the hour. We're through most of the questions that were submitted in advance. I did want to quickly say before we get to the end of our hour, for everyone watching and submitting questions, we do collect the questions, collate them, review them for ones that we feel we can address appropriately and broadly on the live stream. So thank you for the questions that have been coming in. We have been running one sweepstakes raffle. We are in the Year of the Rat for the Lunar New Year, which started, I want to say, January 25th.
I don't know.
Oh, yes. No, it is the new lunar.
Oh, I knew that.
Yes.
I'm just not sure what. I can never remember when it starts.
Oh, yes. Yeah. It was always, I taught abroad in China for a couple of years. So that was the big, that was the big festival. That was the big tradition, was the Lunar New Year. All the students went home for that was the holiday break. And it was strange because it was like, well, when is it? Well, it changes every year. It's based on the lunar calendar. Yeah. So, and it's a little later in January. So as the Year of the Rat, I wanted to ask first, rats, yay or nay?
I have no problem with rats.
Oh, all right. I'll call it a tacit yay. I find them repulsive. My lizard brain is naturally inclined to, hate them to the fullest extent of my hatred.
Wow.
But do you have any examples of mice, rats, were-rats, giant rats that you've used in your game?
I really like were-rats, partly because they are really good in a gothic horror story.
Yes, of course. Yes.
Precisely because they can have to our sort of collective unconscious can trigger, if you put them in a cowl and whatnot, sort of that, the era of the Black Plague, which, was associated in many people's minds with rats. And it's also why that association is why when I've played Warhammer, why I like playing Skaven.
In your Strahd campaign, I imagine were-rats might have made an appearance in some
You know what? They were not a major part of that. Because what I did is I used this time around, because I've run many Ravenloft campaigns, this time around I used Kenku in the sort of position that I would normally use were-rats in.
Okay, yeah.
Because they have a similar effect where you put a cowl on them, with the raven face. Again, there's something very medieval about it and gothic that is wonderful.
Oh, the Kenku in a hood does look like the medieval plague doctor in a lot of ways.
Yep.
So
yeah.
I can certainly see that. I bring it up because for our sweepstakes, our raffle for this week, I dove deep into my personal collection. I've got a copy of Dungeon Magazine 14 back from the 80s.
Wow.
For the winner. We'll throw in a D&D T-shirt as well, but it involves a were-rat adventure. For the next issue of Dragon Plus, we're celebrating a bit of the Year of the Rat, just insofar as they've made many an appearance in Dungeons and Dragons over the years. They make I think not stock or standard, but a pretty understandable low-level encounter. Just the large rat is very relatable, and certainly has been associated with sort of the medieval setting, the rodents of unusual size.
So what you're telling me is next time I DM for you, have a lot of rats.
Oh, a rat with a really long, nasty tail. I think that's the worst part of it for me. A rat looks like it's missing an essential component of itself. It's like a squirrel that's lost all the fur off its tail, and it's just unsettling in some part of my brain.
Yeah.
Yes.
It sounds like your response to rats is like my response to snakes.
I don't know if it's just ingrained, but I think there are certain animals that just give us warning signals as people, especially rats with sharp teeth and snakes with sharp teeth and venom and wasps, I feel like come across the same way.
Yeah.
All terrifying.
Yeah. Yeah, about the only ones that scare me are snakes. Like, I'll let spiders like crawl around in my hand. Yeah, most of those things don't bother me, but you even show me a picture of a snake and I'm like,
Snakes and spiders, also two unsettling animals insofar as they seem to go from 0 to 60, as far as like, it's just lying motionless, nothing to worry about, and then pop, snaps and grabs you.
Yeah.
That's no good. And I saw Dan Dillon in the chat as well, so I've been trying to coerce him into contributing rat-related material for the next issue of Dragon Plus as well. So look for that at the end of February 27th. We'll have our next issue out, and then I'll save my questions regarding battlefield tactics and adventures and scenarios for our next chat.
All right.
Because I do have questions. So again, we're getting close to 2 o'clock, so we're going to be signing off here, but I wanted to say thank you, as always, to everyone taking an hour out of your day to tune in, submit your questions, and we do try and get to as many as we reasonably can. Thanks, as always, to our followers, subscribers, of course, to our moderators, and thanks to Jeremy for spending an hour out of his day for answering the questions with us.
Good to be here.
Yes. So we're, as mentioned several times now, we're going to make it a more frequent occurrence. So we will make sure also to give more forewarning in advance when Jeremy is coming on so that you can prepare your questions in advance. All right, everyone, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.